everybody. Welcome to this brand new episode of the Satisfied God podcast. Rabon, Byrd here with you once again. Always a pleasure. Thanks for downloading and streaming and passing it on to friends, telling others about it and sharing it. Also, if you're able to, from the site or where you listen, like it, make comments, whether iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, different places. If you go to our YouTube page and listen to it on that, you can subscribe to the page, you can like it, you can make comments, and it helps. And the overall scheme of things, it helps other people be able to see it too when there's some traffic going there and some things happening, such as likes, comments, and that type of activity. So we appreciate that as well. This episode is going to be an upload of the Known of God classes like we've been doing. In fact, what I'm doing here, I'll put this one up today, and then in a couple of days I'm going to put the next in this series up. So you'll get two of the Known of God classes in the next couple of days, today, and then a couple of days from now I'll put another up. I'm doing that because there's some things going on here that has kind of hindered me from being able to just sit down and take the time to record a class, but I have been working on some things that I want to share with you during these times, but right now I haven't been able to just sit down and record. So I'm putting these up to maybe make up the difference and make me feel like I'm not letting anybody down. So I'm putting these two close together so you can listen to those and have that to chew on. And I think these are two very good episodes of the Known of God classes. This one begins by examining the nature of the foundation of God that stands sure. And in this episode, I'll get into it, and you see by the title the word obstinate. That's what the word sure means there in Timothy, where it says the foundation of God stands sure, having this seal: the Lord knows those that are his. The word sure actually means obstinate, and those of you know that, or those of you listening know that obstinate means to be stubborn, mule-headed, to be unmoved, unrelenting, and unshakable. And that's the foundation of God upon which we now stand. If we are born of God, if we are born again, we stand upon a foundation that is stubbornly unmovable. It will not bend, it will not move, it will not in any way shift to the right or to the left for any reason, because there is a seal, sealed by God himself, like the signet ring of the king, has placed a seal upon this great foundation upon which we stand, the rock that is Christ himself, and that foundation's seal is the knowledge of God concerning our soul in Christ. Being known of God, standing in the perfection of our life and our salvation, is the seal of this foundation. The Lord knows those who are his, and his knowing will not be overthrown. His knowing cannot be moved. He will not be talked out of it. You cannot change his opinion, because God does not work upon opinion. There is nothing that can change here. And I hope that we understand that with regard to our salvation, how obstinate, unmovable, and sure it really is. So we deal with that in this session, beginning there, and then in our next episode in a couple days, we'll begin with the rebellion of Korah and how that is really, most commentaries will tell us, that is where Paul gets this statement, the Lord knows those that are his. So we have to go into Numbers to look at the rebellion of Korah to see the full extent of this statement and what God does to drive home his point that the surety of his relationship with the whole of the nation of Israel was not based upon any specific or group of that nation. It was already by God provided to them in their high priest. God had established a relationship in their midst. And no matter how much they wanted to have a relationship that they could call their own, that they could glory in, that they could boast in, because they were assured of the fact that they were holy. They were just as holy as those that God had chosen to stand before him. We will see God's answer. And that's where God will say, or Moses will say to them, the Lord will know those that are his. And so that brings a fuller picture as to the knowing of God and just how sure it is and how singular it is. And that's what makes it eternally obstinate and unmoved. And I hope we can rest in this. We rest in the surety of it just by the presentation of it as the gospel, but we also must see this one. Our hearts must come to be aware by the Spirit's work, come to a recognition internally of this one who is unmoved and who stands as an anchor for our soul in the presence of God, establishing in himself, as himself, the fullness of relationship. So that's why we're going to set these two together. I think one leads right into another nicely, and I think they will help. So that's what we're going to do. Hope you enjoy it. Love you guys. Amen. Well, welcome to our class tonight. We are still in our series, Known of God. We're in class 18. And just want to get right into the lesson tonight. I want to reread something that we looked at in our last class. And before I do that, let me read the verse that it has reference to. This is Malachi chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. The burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi, I have loved you, saith the Lord. Yet ye say, wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord? Yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau. And I laid his mountains and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness. Now, we looked at something of this in the last class, and what I want to do is just read the commentary with regard to this, because it's from the Wheeler's syntax notes, and just speaking of the use of language here in the Hebrew language, that the phrase, I have loved you, is actually in the perfect tense. And, I at one point I just would overlook that and not give much thought to it. But when I began to read the commentary, it brought everything that we have been saying up to this point into a little clearer perspective. It seems to demonstrate and define just in the language itself, just looking at the Hebrew language here. It seems to demonstrate the overall definitive nature of God's knowing toward us, God's relationship toward us. It reminds me, reading this in Malachi chapter 1, reminds me of something we've talked about in earlier classes, real early on. And it's in Jeremiah 31:3, where he says, I have loved thee with an everlasting love. And we talked about that it is a love that is everlasting. It's not a love that came about because of us. It's a love that He's brought, we could say He's brought us into, or that He has brought into us. A love that is eternal, that has no reference to us at all. It's just the grace of God that it is that love that He has shed abroad in our hearts. It is that everlasting love, the love a relation. He could say this, I have known you with an everlasting knowing. I have related to you with an everlasting relationship. He could say that. It's the same thing. It's God relating or loving us, relating to us in view of that which is eternally sure and perfect and complete. And that's what we'll read in this Wheeler's notes here. We said that this love was established before we even existed. It's like Israel, before they were truly Israel, before they were truly brought into it by blood, but before God truly brought them out with a strong hand of deliverance, before any of that, God knew them. And if you even go before that, He knew them in the light of a covenant with Abraham. In Genesis 15, He speaks about everything that took place in Exodus. He speaks of it before any of that. He speaks of it to Abraham. And He confirms all of that in this cutting of a covenant. And we've talked about that in earlier classes, where it was a covenant between the Father and the Son, the fire pot and the torch that walked through the pieces of flesh that was separated, and the blood, and it walked through it, cutting a covenant, confirming, ratifying, establishing a covenant with Himself, the Father and the Son, and saying, confirming everything that took place. In other words, God knew them in the light of this covenant before He ever brought them into it by the blood. He knew them because it was in accordance to an everlasting knowing. It was in accordance to a covenant that He had cut before. So nothing of this can be referenced in us, and it cannot be determined by us. I looked up the word everlasting, the one we just read in Jeremiah 31:3. And that word everlasting, yes, it means always, it means continual, eternal, perpetual, but it also means something that struck me. The root of the word is 5956 in the Strong's. It's alam. And it means something that is veiled from sight. Something that is concealed, that is secret, that is hidden. And I begin to think, this speaks of this love wherewith He has loved us in beautiful terms, in a beautiful way. It speaks of something with regard to this love that I'd never really considered, but we always know is true, or we know that is true, that it's a hidden thing. It's something that is concealed, that is undiscoverable to the natural faculties of the natural man. It is that which eye hath not seen, ear hath not heard, and the heart of man cannot enter into. But the Spirit of God has been given and reveals that love, that relationship, that we may know this grace that has been freely given to us or bestowed unto us, it says in the literal, in grace. in Christ. This knowing, this eternal relating of God toward us must be revealed, or we will remain ignorant of that love and attempt to know or obtain His love by some other means. I want us to see in this, there is something that stands sure. Something that stands everlastingly settled, fixed, that is unmovable, irrevocable. And that is, it is Christ in us. Because it is Christ in us who is the love of God unto us. It is Christ in us that is the covenant unto us, that is the relation of God to my soul. The only means by which my soul can relate to God is that the Son of His love resides in that soul. And that's a sure and fixed reality. And that is the reality the Spirit of God is at all times attempting to reveal and make known and bring my soul to the acknowledgement of. So back to this commentary on the perfect tense of I have loved you in Malachi. Again, this is from Wheeler's Syntax Notes. And I quote here, "The perfect tense is better viewed as indicating a completed situation. It serves to express actions, events, or states which the speaker wishes to represent from the point of view of completion. And they are pictured in their completed state. The perfect views the situation as whole. It focuses on it as a single whole, as a summary, in a summary fashion. Thus, nothing of time or process or procedure is discussed or implied. The author portrays the act or the state from what is called the external viewpoint. He stands viewing the whole of the matter without any reference to any internal workings or details. He speaks as one who is able to see the beginning and the ending of the situation. You see that? I have loved you. Has no reference to the internal details, to what we would call the process. That has no reference to that at all. It is spoken from one who is beholding the beginning and the end of that situation. He is beholding it as a completed thing, as something that is perfect and full in its content. It has nothing missing, nothing lacking with regard to it. This is the certainty of our life in Christ. Because the beginning and the end that He is beholding in that is Christ living in us. The complete and perfect situation that He is seeing definitely has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with the one who lives in me. My view, our view, the problem is, our view is constantly, seemingly, the imperfections and the workings and the processes and the ups and the downs and the things that we go through because our soul is ignorant of this complete state that He beholds. The view of God, God's perspective, God's understanding, God's faith. That beholds the one who is the Alpha and the Omega with regard to my salvation. It is a perfect reality. It's a fixed and a settled thing.
God has, and is beholding the beginning and the ending of my salvation. Again, I think this is why Hebrews speaks in this manner in chapter 6 of Hebrews, verses 18 and 19. Let's look at this. He speaks of that expectation, that hope that we have as an anchor for the soul. And he defines that in a person. Let's read it. Verse 18. That by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation, who have fled for refuge. Listen to these words. Who have fled for refuge, to lay hold upon the hope that is set before us. To lay hold, to apprehend, to seize that expectation that is set before our view, that is set before our face, that is set before our eyes. It is that ark set out before us that we are to pursue. It is Paul saying that I count all the other as loss, and I desire to apprehend that for which I am apprehended. I desire to lay hold and apprehend that which is set before me. They have fled from the things that merely testified. They have fled from that which would usurp the place of Christ Himself. They fled from that and have come to the substance Himself, have come to the Son in whom God hath spoken in a perfect and full and utter way, that they may lay hold of Him and apprehend Him as that perfect reality that chapter 6 begins speaking of. But it is an expectation, and what got me was this the way it's worded here. The hope, the expectation, which is not, the hope is not in verse 19 in the original. It actually says to lay hold upon the hope set before us, verse 19, which we have, speaking of that hope, as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, which entereth into that within the veil. It's an expectation that we have that is the anchor of the soul. Something sure, something steadfast, because that expectation is set upon something that is sure, that is eternally sure, that is fixed and settled in the heart of God. It is that perfect situation that is before His face, that is the gaze and the view of His heart. It's that one in view of whom He can say, I have loved you. It's the one who is the perfect salvation, and that perfect must appear in our hearts, so that we can, as he's attempting to get these in this Hebrew letter, bring them to, is so that they, in the light of the perfect, can put away the things of the child, put away the things of the shadows, the pieces, the fragments, and live in the light of this one. He embodies this one. It's this one who stands in the presence of God. It's the high priest. He goes on in the next verses and talks about that. This high priest that stands there in the holiest of all before God. That's the one who is the anchor. That is the object of our expectation. What? So that He can appear. It's the anchor. The Exegetical Dictionary uses this phrase. It says, the anchor, that which provides support and inward stability. Our expectation is towards the appearing of this one, to find in Him and apprehend in His revealed presence the certainty and the surety, the amen of all that is already and has always been certain in Him. They could not know. You have to understand, the high priest in his standing in the Holy of Holies was already their salvation. Perfect, accepted, received of God. God's view was perfectly set and satisfied upon this one. They had no idea. In God's heart, in God's perspective, it was fulfilled, it was complete, their atonement was done. He beheld in that one a perfect situation. And could say to the whole of Israel, I have loved you. Could say to the whole of Israel, you are atoned. You have relation to me. He could say that because his view was this one who stood accepted and perfect before him. But Israel, those who were waiting, knew nothing of it, could experience nothing of it. They could not know even as they were known of God until He appeared. Until they saw Him. It is what Peter says. Let's turn there. Peter says this. Speaking of this perfect salvation, this great salvation that we have, that even the prophets spoke of and desired, but knew that it was not unto themselves that they spoke, even that which angels themselves desired to look into or peer into. He says this. Wherefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and set your hope, your expectation perfectly, that's the word to the end, perfectly for the grace that is being brought unto you in the revelation of Jesus Christ. Set your expectation perfectly upon that one. On Him who is the embodiment of the salvation all the prophets spoke of. That He may appear, and that in His appearing, in His being revealed, the grace is being brought. I better put it on airplane mode. In that one, in His appearing, you're experiencing, you're beholding, you will live in the light of that grace that is continually being brought in His appearing, in the revealing of Him. The word brought there, I looked it up just to look, but it's very, the Louw-Nida said something very significant, I think. This word brought is not just bringing something to you, it is to present the evidence of something having actually taken place. In His appearing, He comes as the evidence that something has happened, that something has taken place. He appears in your soul as the evidence of a new order of things, as the embodiment of a new order of things. And in that seeing of Him, that grace that is being brought unto us, whereby He has made unto us the fullness of salvation, that He has made unto us in His presence the love and relation of God to our souls. We live in that understanding. The soul is able to comprehend that great transition that has taken place. And we are able to to, in the pursuit of that greater reality that comes in His face and His appearing, we're able to count everything else as lost, count everything else as done. So that we can, as Paul, who found that refuge and has in that desires to lay hold and to apprehend that which is set before him, he can say, my desire is to be found in Him, having nothing of my own. See, that is a soul that is beholding the grace of God. That is a soul that is beholding the love of God, saying, my only desire, the only pursuit that I have is to be found in Him, having nothing but who I am knowing Him to be, having nothing but who He is in me, who He has made unto me. I am not attempting to bring myself into this picture, but I will rest fully in the reality of His sufficiency. I will rest, say it this way, I will rest in hope. I will rest, continually rest in a reality and keep my expectations set in the greater and more perfect seeing and viewing of that reality. The pulpit commentary, which I don't read a whole lot, but I read it with reference to this, 1 Peter 1:13. He says, this being brought in the revelation, the grace being brought in the revelation of Jesus Christ, he says that is being brought. It is an unceasing and ever-enlarging bestowment, but he's wrong in that. It is not an ever-enlarging and unceasing bestowment. It is actually my soul experiencing an unceasing and ever-enlarging view of the bestowment of grace, of everything that God has in grace bestowed unto us in His Son, as His Son. Understand this? What I'm trying to say is that there is a perfect situation that is before God at all times, but it is in the seeing of that one who is that perfect situation that my soul begins to know and apprehend and live and experience and enjoy such a completed state. That completed state is there the moment I'm born again, because He is there. He is present. But it is my soul coming to the acknowledgement of that presence. And in that acknowledgement of His presence, what has already taken place, what has already happened, what has actually brought about, what is... I could go into a lot of verses where Paul says, I suffer the things I suffer, that those to whom I speak and minister may obtain the salvation that has eternal glory. The word obtain is not to get, it is to experience something that has already happened. You can look it up in I think it's the Loanita or the Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament. It uses that phrase. It is to experience something that has already taken place. It is to experience something that's already a reality in you. That should be the thing unto which our expectation is set. That's the object of our expectation. That anchor. That one who stands before Him that He may appear and be seen and be revealed and known as everything that He is unto the Father. That I may know Him as everything He is. That's knowing Him as He is. That's when Christ, who is our life, shall appear. We don't get anything more in His appearing. We see the much more that we possess and are yet ignorant of. Our great salvation is complete. It is a complete situation. The problem is our soul remains veiled to God's view of completion. But we understand that the work of God's Spirit is to reveal such a completed state in our souls. This is why we began all of these classes in Galatians chapter 4:9, where it says, after you have known God, or rather are known of God, why do you seek to be brought back under the bondage of these weak and beggarly elements? Why do you desire to be brought back under the bondage of these things? And Paul rightly, we've said it many times, rightly sets the weight of the whole matter, everything, the weight of our salvation. He rightly sets it upon the foundation, the basis, the premise of God's knowing of us, not on our knowing of Him. This is not an excuse to be indifferent with regard to our knowing of Him, but I'm telling you, our knowing or our attempted knowing of Him will be misdirected, based upon something woefully insufficient until His knowing of us is first revealed. His knowing of us must first be revealed before there is any progress, any positive movement with regard to our knowing of Him. Because if His knowing of us is not first revealed, we have no basis. We have no ground upon which to seek to know Him. All we have is the shifting sand of the natural mind that's up and down, up and down. We have the insufficiencies, the insecurities that we see assessing ourselves. I'm telling you, the ground of seeking, the perfect ground of seeking, is the ground of God's knowing of us in His Son. That must first be revealed. What I'm saying is, Christ must first be revealed in you before there will ever be any knowing of Him at all. Salvation must be revealed before we can grow in the knowledge of that salvation. So I bring these things back up, this verse back up, because I want to look at something that I think it speaks to. In the midst of the chaos of man's imaginations with regard to relationship with God, serving God, in Galatians, Paul feels it necessary to point to the sure foundation God has laid, that sure foundation that remains ever before him. We have to understand that it is possible and probable that we can have our faith overthrown or subverted if we are not settled upon the only true foundation. We're going to read that verse. We are totally susceptible to have our faith, listen to that, our faith, overthrown by the errors of man, the perversity of human philosophy or religious philosophy, if we are not having this foundation laid or revealed in our hearts, because that foundation remains untouched by error or perversion. It stands, it remains, and I thank God there is something that remains. In the midst of my ignorance, there is something that remains. There is something sure. There is something that is complete. There is something perfect to which God is calling my soul constantly. Something He is calling my soul to comprehend. A perfect situation that is forever His perspective, He is calling my soul that it may apprehend His perspective, comprehend and know in the light of His understanding, His view revealed in my soul. Paul says, if that which has been done away, put away, was glorious, how much more that which remains? There's something that remains. Paul, I think it's in Romans 3 where he talks about what if some did not believe? Does that negate the faith of God? Does that make nothing the faith of God? God forbid. Let God be true and every man a liar. God's faith and His faithfulness, because the faithfulness of God is tied to the faith of God, the understanding, the knowing of God. That to which He is faithful is bound up with His understanding, His view. It remains untouched by my ignorance, untouched by whatever perversions may come. There's something that remains. There is something to which God is at all times calling my soul upward and onward to a greater view of reality. Because there is a reality. There is an eternal, everlasting, fixed and settled reality. And it's embodied in the person of Christ who lives in us. It is that reality that remains. It remains as what God has as His own rest. It is the rest that God Himself has. And even when my ignorance abounds, the reality that is in me remains. And the Spirit of God would unveil my soul to a greater view of that reality. And dispel ignorance in the light of the truth. But 2 Timothy 2, let's go there. 2 Timothy chapter 2. Verse 17 through 19. And their word will eat as doth a canker, of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus, who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already, and overthrow, not over. Is it overthrown or overthrow? I got it marked. I circled it. I think it's overthrow the faith of some. Nevertheless, verse 19, the foundation of God standeth sure, having this seal, the Lord knoweth them that are His. And let every one that nameth the name of Christ depart from iniquity. Now, I want to look at this for a second, because, of course, we'll get to this phrase, the Lord knoweth them that are His, because that's what I want to look at, whether we get there in this class or not. But I want to look at something at the beginning of this. He's talking about those, he names two people who concerning the truth have erred. I want to look at that for a second. What is that error? And I think this has a lot to do with what we've been saying. Remember, we were talking in couple of previous classes, recent classes, I think, where everything that pertains to us, everything that, according to the testimony, everything that represented Israel and pertained to Israel in relation to the high priest was totally bound to him, tied and bound, never to be loosed from, it says. And I think you see that here in this phrase, who have erred concerning the truth. Such error concerning the truth. What is that? Because the disruption Paul speaks of that comes about as a result of this error is always relative to where the anchor is, or the object upon which your expectation is set. So what does it mean to err concerning the truth? It's in regard to the truth, so we have to think about the truth. And I'm not going to get into a study of the truth, but the truth is actually that substance that stood as the basis of every testimony, that stood as the basis of the testimony itself. It is the body that cast that shadow. It is the person whose body cast the shadow we call the testimony. That's the truth. It's the person of Christ. It is Christ Himself. It is that eternal object of substantiation, of confirmation, of conclusion, of fulfillment. Therefore, what does it mean in the light of that to err concerning the truth? Well, let's look at it in reference to the resurrection. I believe it means that they attempt to proclaim the resurrection outside of the light of its truth, or the truth. In other words, they are declaring the resurrection as something other than who Christ is. They speak of the resurrection as something that has come and gone, declaring anything of our salvation as something separate from His person or His presence in us. In other words, it is taking the resurrection and calling it something instead of declaring someone as the resurrection itself. It is not bringing that term or that spiritual thing to its spiritual fulfillment. So you could say, in the light of that, the resurrection is an event that has come and gone. And if someone's soul is not beholding Christ and knowing and experiencing Christ as the resurrection and the life, their faith, their belief, the thing upon which they stand can be overthrown, can be shaken, troubled, subverted. But when the soul is not comprehending Christ as the resurrection, it is essentially human to point to something such as a natural event or even a supernatural happening to give that certain thing meaning or a conclusive end. When the soul is not seeing Him as the end, we will still seek one. When the soul is not seeing or knowing Him as our relationship with God, we will seek one aside from Him. This is what we have been stating. God has set it forth that nothing that pertains to our salvation will ever be loosed or separate from Him. To err concerning the truth is attempting to find any spiritual term or object divorced from their eternal and conclusive substance. The word err means basically to miss the mark, to deviate from the goal. This is about being secured in a living relationship with the person who is the embodiment of all spiritual fullness. True faith is Him being revealed in the soul and the soul experiencing Him as who He is. I had this commentary about righteousness, and it's from the Exegetical Dictionary of the New Testament. It says this, and you can relate this to every thing, every term that speaks of a spiritual reality. The meaning of the word righteousness, it says, as a concept of relationship, which was shaped in a particular way in the Old Testament and Jewish tradition, is to be given precedent over the normal Greek meaning of righteousness as a category within the teachings of virtue. What he's saying is that the way we should understand righteousness is the way that the Old Testament declared righteousness. It is the way Jewish tradition declared righteousness. That it was not codes of conduct and moral behavior. That was not the thing that defined righteousness. Righteousness, according to the Old Testament, had to do with relationship. It had to do with the relationship of, Israel's relationship concerning the law. Their relationship, their obedience to the law. It was a relationship with God of living in a continual obedience to the law. Well, it's the same thing in Christ. It is my soul living in a continual relationship with the law of life, with the life who is righteousness, with the life who is my holiness, relationship with God, the perfection of all spiritual realities. It is my soul experiencing all that He is through a living relationship with who He is. It is not about what I do and don't do. That's not an excuse to do all you want to do. It's about my soul. The greater reality is my soul apprehending, knowing, and living in the light of Him who has made unto me everything that I am not. He has made unto me the perfect and full and complete salvation of the Lord. It is my soul in a continual relationship with that one, seeing all things bound, inseparable to His person and who He is. Not trying, being ignorant of that righteousness to produce one of my own or to establish one of my own, but seeing the one God has established. States it well. It is found in and as Him. Everything else is error and perversion. Everything else is error and perversion. However, there is that foundation that remains sure, that remains steadfast. Nothing of our salvation can be apprehended aside from the apprehension of Him who is our life. There is nothing that is our own when it comes to spiritual life. Yet there is this constant cry in the natural man to God, have you anything left for me? Is there a blessing that remains for me? And just as we read in our last class with Esau and Jacob, the father looks and says, I have blessed him. I have blessed Jacob. And in the literal version it says, I have blessed him and he shall remain blessed. That is the thing that remains. All things are secured in the singleness of God's knowing of us. Paul can say, nevertheless, the foundation of God standeth sure, having this seal, the Lord knoweth those that are His. The sure foundation has a seal. It is sealed. And I believe it to be the foundation that is set before Joshua in Zechariah 3, upon which 7 eyes are set. And that is engraved with an engraving, or that is sealed with an engraving. The seal that is upon this foundation is defined by Paul as God's own knowing. whatever error, whatever perversion, whatever ignorance may come, God's knowing remains. The foundation remains. It remains sure. As we close, I want to look at this word sure, because I wanted to get further and in this, but I began to look at this word. And I thought I knew what the word sure means, but I saw something that defined it a little more perfectly for me. And I think speaks to this very well, what we're going to talk about and what we'll talk about in our next class. So let's consider the word sure here. There is a foundation that standeth sure. This foundation sealed by God's own knowing, His knowing of and in view of a perfect and complete situation, abides sure. The word sure has many definitions, but one that I read in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, I think speaks to the true nature of this knowing. This dictionary defined the word sure as obstinate. Now, it also used words like rigid, hard, true, valid, perfect. It used the Latin word integer, which means something that is untouched, uninjured, whole, and entire. But this word obstinate stood out. And I think it speaks very well to what we'll get to, that I have read in certain commentaries, that is the basis and the source that Paul gets this phrase, the Lord, the source from which he gets this phrase, the Lord knoweth those that are His. I think this word obstinate stands and defines it very well. Obstinate means stubbornly adherent or unmovably devoted to a course of action or a purpose, to an attitude or an understanding. Unyielding, inflexible, unbending. Refusing to change one's chosen course despite attempts to persuade one to do so. Well, God, I pray a lot and I do this and I do that. No, the foundation of God stands sure. It stands obstinate. It refuses to bend to such lusts of the flesh, to such desires of the flesh. It will not bend. There is one blessing. There is one Son that I love, and He remains blessed. It's obstinate. It is sure. That's why it is the anchor of my soul. That is why it is so sure and certain and perfect. Because it does not bend. It does not move. It's that foundation that men stumble over. It is that stone of offense. Why is it an offense? Because it doesn't move. It doesn't yield. It doesn't bend to my lusts and my desires. It is fixed, settled, laid of God forever. That's what makes it so sure. But I'm telling you, it is certain and sure, and that is the thing that secures our soul. That is the reality of our salvation. It's perfect and sure in this way, but it's also unbending to anything that would try to contradict it. Anything that is brought before it contrary. God has chosen. And that is why I believe that the heart of man, and I'm speaking to those of us who are born again, that our hearts continually fight and struggle against the very thing that secures us. because in its nature it is obstinate to that which is contrary. It is unmoved and unyielding. The nature of the great salvation we have, the nature of God's knowing, is unyielding to the lust of our flesh that motivates us. He remains unmovably devoted and faithful to the fellowship of the Son unto which He has called us. And therefore He recognizes no other attempt or desire to create one of our own. There is a great consequence when facing this sure foundation. It is this rock upon which we must fall and be broken. Or it falls on us and grinds us to powder. And we suffer great loss. You understand, that's why in Hebrews, and we talked about it Monday night, Jimmy and I, that's why in Hebrews, and all of the warnings that are given throughout Hebrews, it's always based upon something that is settled, something that is a reality. It's never based upon missing something that's not yet present. It's about neglecting something that has been given of God to the soul and settling for something less. Because God has nothing else for us. You miss this, you've missed it. You settle for something less, God will not bring something. There's not a third option here. So many have and do still stumble at this stone of offense. This fixed, this unyielding reality of Christ in us. Because they desire to have something or to be something also. Aside from Him. Expecting and lusting after something that is contrary to what God has set in the midst. What God has set in our midst that shall never be moved or amended. Remember Galatians 3? And it talks about the covenant, and once it is ratified and established, nothing can be added to it. No amendments can be added to it. No stipulations can be added to it. Well, I'm telling you, we call this knowing our salvation in the context of an eternal covenant. There is a covenant that has been ratified. There is a relationship that is established and that God has given to the soul. And that the nature of that relationship, the nature of that covenant is unyielding. It is obstinate to anything contrary. It is unyielding, unbending to the mind of man, to the desires of the flesh, to possess something of its own. And this is why we can rejoice in a salvation that is so great and so sure and so perfect. But again, it seems that the natural mind, or the religiously motivated mind of man, stands in opposition, stands against the very thing that secures it. The very thing that secures us. Why? Because we want something of our own, instead of finding all things of life, all things of godliness, all things of reality, to be the one who lives in us. God will not put your face on that which is only defined in His. The Spirit of God is at all times desiring to unveil our souls to the face of the truth Himself, of the truth. That we will not err concerning the truth. That we live in that truth, live in that reality, and rest and delight. Not war against, but live in rest and delight in the unmovable and unyielding nature of God's knowing of us. Well, I'll stop there. I'm out of time. So, let me stop there. And we'll go on into we're going to go into number 16 with regard to Korah. And then in number 17, and how God continually makes his point. One shall stand before me. I have chosen one. One. The singleness of God's knowing is indeed the security of our salvation. May our hearts come to know that one and live daily in the enjoyment of that one as our life. All right. Thanks for being with us tonight.